She was 8 months pregnant, standing in the cold hallway of her own home, holding an eviction notice that had her signature on it, except she had never signed it. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, not from weakness, but from the particular, controlled fury of a woman who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to destroy people in courtrooms. Because the woman standing across from her, the woman who had handed her that document with a triumphant smile stretching across her freshly lipsticked mouth, had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that the quiet, gentle, heavily pregnant woman in front of her was not just a wife, not just a daughter, not just someone who could be pushed out of her own home with a forged signature and a smug expression. She was an attorney, and she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Let that settle for a moment. Because this story isn't just about betrayal, though the betrayal is breathtaking in its cruelty. This story isn't just about a forged document, though the audacity of what was done will leave you speechless. This story is about what happens when a woman who has fought in every courtroom, in every case, in every legal battle thrown at her over the course of her entire career, finally has to fight for herself, for her home, for her unborn child, for her dignity, and she is going to win. Stay with me, because this one is going to take you through every single emotion before it's done. Her name was, Clara Whitfield, though she had been Clara Moreno for the last 4 years, since she married Marcus Moreno in a beautiful outdoor ceremony surrounded by the people she believed loved her. Clara was 34 years old, and if you looked at her on any given Tuesday morning, you would see a tall, composed woman with dark eyes that were always slightly too perceptive, always reading a room. The way a chess player reads a board. She had the kind of stillness about her that made opposing counsel nervous, because when Clara was still, something was happening behind those eyes, something methodical, something patient. She had grown up in a small city in the Midwest, the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic who had worked themselves to the bone to give their children something better. Clara had been the kind of child who read everything: contracts, encyclopedias, the fine print on cereal boxes. She was 12 years old when her family got into a dispute with a landlord who was trying to illegally withhold their security deposit. And Clara, 12 years old and furious, had gone to the library, found the relevant tenant protection statutes for their state, typed up a formal letter citing those statutes specifically, and sent it to the landlord herself. They got the deposit back within a week. Her parents had laughed about it. Their daughter, the little lawyer Dot. It wasn't a joke by the time she was 25. By then she had graduated top of her class from law school, had passed the bar on her first attempt, and had taken a position at one of the city's most respected mid-sized litigation firms, the kind of firm that didn't take cases for the money, but took cases they believed in. Clara specialized in property law and civil litigation. In plain terms, that meant she spent her days fighting over land, over buildings, over documents, over the ownership of things. She knew real estate law the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every bone, every nerve, every vulnerability. She had fought title fraud cases. She had prosecuted forged deed cases. She had seen every trick, every scheme, every clever manipulation that desperate or greedy people tried to use when they wanted to take something that didn't belong to them. She had seen all of it, which is why, when she saw that eviction notice, she knew in approximately 3 seconds exactly what had been done, how it had been done, and precisely how catastrophically it was going to backfire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on that cold Thursday morning in February, you have to go back. You have to understand how Clara ended up married to Marcus Moreno. You have to understand who Marcus was, and more importantly, who his mother was. Marcus Moreno was the kind of man who was extraordinarily easy to love in the beginning. That's the thing that Clara would reflect on later. In her quietest moments, how easy it had been, how natural. He had walked into a charity gala she attended 4 years ago, wearing a dark suit and a particular kind of confident, unhurried smile that suggested a man who had never once been told no by anyone he wanted to impress. He was handsome in a conventional, almost catalog-perfect way, strong jaw, warm brown eyes, the kind of height that makes a room feel slightly reorganized when someone walks in. He had approached her at the bar. He had said something clever. She had said something cleverer. He had laughed, genuinely laughed. Not the performative chuckle that men often use when a woman outwits them, but real laughter, delighted, almost surprised. She had liked that. It had disarmed her. They had dated for 18 months. He was attentive, he was generous, he called when he said he would call. He remembered small things, the name of her childhood dog, the way she took her coffee, the author she had mentioned, liking once in passing, whose entire backlist he had ordered and left on her doorstep with a note. He was the kind of thoughtful that felt deliberate, curated, like he had studied the blueprint of what a good partner looked like, and had committed to executing it flawlessly. She had thought she was the luckiest woman alive. She had not yet met his mother, Alina Moore. The name alone, the way Marcus said it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his posture should have told Clara everything she needed to know. But when you are in love, you forgive small signals. You explain, they're my work. You give benefit of the doubt to the person you adore. Elena Moreno was 62 years old, a widow for the past 8 years, and the owner of a small but lucrative property management company that her late husband had built from nothing and that Elena had run with considerable skill, it must be said, ever since his death. She was a slight woman, elegantly dressed, in that particularly aggressive way of women who believe that appearance is a weapon. She wore her silver hair in a precise chignon. She had rings on nearly every finger. She smiled constantly, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. It stopped somewhere around her cheekbones and went no further. Clara met her for the first time at a dinner Marcus had organized at his family home, a dinner that Alina had clearly choreographed as an audition more than an introduction. She had asked Clara polite questions with unpleasant subtext. She had commented on Clara's job in that particular tone that manages to simultaneously compliment and diminish. Oh, how impressive. A lawyer. How very serious. Marcus always did admire ambitious women with a micro-pause before the word. Ambitious, that was doing a great deal of work. Clara had smiled. She had been gracious. She had, professionally speaking, been cross-examined by people far more skilled than Elena Moreno, and had emerged without a scratch. But she had noticed she had filed Alina away in the particular mental cabinet she kept for people who required monitoring, the cabinet she rarely opened, but never forgot. Marcus proposed 14 months after their first date, on a quiet evening at home, with a ring Clara had once pointed to in a vintage jewelry store window and promptly forgotten about. He had remembered. Of course he had remembered. The man who remembered everything had gone back to that jewelry store, had found the ring, had bought it. It was, Clara would admit later, a genuinely beautiful proposal. She said yes. Elena gave a toast at the engagement party that was so carefully, surgically passive-aggressive that Clara had found herself genuinely admiring the craft of it while also recognizing it as a declaration of war. The wedding was beautiful. The first year of marriage was good, not perfect, but good, with the particular warmth of two people genuinely building something together. They bought a house, not his house, not her house, their house, or so she believed. The house was Clara's, actually. She had purchased it using money she had saved herself 15 years of careful, disciplined savings, combined with an inheritance from her grandmother who had passed 2 years prior. The down payment had come entirely from Clara's accounts. The mortgage was in both their names, but the initial purchase, the foundation of ownership that had been, she had insisted on it. Not out of suspicion, not out of distrust, but out of the simple, uncompromising practicality of a woman who had spent her entire career watching what happens when people don't formalize their financial relationships. She had every document, every record, every receipt. She had, as lawyers say, a very clean chain of title, and then she got pregnant. The pregnancy announcement was genuinely joyful. Clara had cried. Marcus had cried. They had held each other in the kitchen at midnight after she showed him the tests, and it had felt like the beginning of the most important chapter of their lives. She was 34, he was 37. They had talked about children, had wanted children, and now here it was. Real, growing, miraculous. The first signs that something was wrong were small enough that Clara, in the fog of first trimester exhaustion, almost missed them. Marcus began calling his mother more frequently. Long calls, conducted in the other room with the door pulled most of the way close. When Clara would appear in the doorway, he would shift slightly, angling his body away, and wrap up the conversation quickly. She noticed, but she didn't push. Couples needed their separate family relationships. She gave him the space. Then came the comments. They started with the house. Mum thinks the house is too far from her, said casually, over dinner. Mum says that neighborhood isn't ideal for raising children, said in the car one Saturday, looking straight ahead. Mum says, with the baby coming, we should think about our living situation," said in that careful, neutral tone that Clara had learned to recognize as Marcus relaying something Elena had instructed him to relay. And then, one evening, about 4 months into the pregnancy, Marcus sat down across from Clara at the kitchen table and said something that made her set down a glass of water very carefully and give him her full, undivided attention. He said, "Mum thinks it might be better if the house was in her name, just temporarily, for financial planning purposes. She has contacts who can help us with some tax arrangements. It would be easier with a baby coming." Clara looked at him for a long, even moment. Then she said, "No, just no. Clean, simple, without elaboration." The single syllable of a woman who had heard too many versions of this sentence in too many conference rooms to need to hear the rest of it. Marcus had looked surprised, genuinely surprised, as if he had not anticipated that the answer could be anything other than yes. He had tried again. He had reframed it. He had used softer language. He had said his mother was only trying to help. He had said it would be temporary. He had said Clara was being unnecessarily suspicious. Clara had said, "Marcus, I am a property attorney. I have spent 15 years watching people lose their homes because they transferred title temporarily to someone they trusted. The answer is no. The house stays in our names. That conversation is closed." He had dropped a dot, or so she thought. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known. Because it was happening in meetings she was not invited to, in conversations she was not part of, in visits Elena paid to a notary whose ethical compass had been significantly compromised by financial persuasion, was that Elena had decided that Clara's no was not the final word. It was just an obstacle. And Elena Moreno had been removing obstacles for the entirety of her 62 years. Elena had a man she used. His name was Gerald Peck, and he ran a small notary and document services office on the eastern side of the city, in the kind of strip mall that always seems to have one vacant unit and a payday loan place. Gerald had done work for Elena before, nothing dramatic, nothing that had ever come back to haunt him. Just the quiet greasing of bureaucratic wheels that Elena occasionally required in the course of a property management business. A backdated lease here, a signature authenticated without the signer being physically present there. Small things, deniable things. The kind of things that people like Elena told themselves were not really wrong because no one was really getting hurt. This, however, was considerably larger. Elena had obtained a copy of the deed to Clara and Marcus's home, not difficult. Since deeds are public records, she had obtained a sample of Clara's signature from an old check that Marcus Dessard, without fully understanding what he was enabling, had provided because his mother had asked him to, and because Marcus had a deeply ingrained inability to say no to his mother in the same way that Clara had a deeply ingrained inability to say yes to anyone asking her to surrender something that was hers. Gerald Peck had produced a deed, a document used to transfer property ownership bearing what appeared to be Clara's signature, notarized with Gerald's official seal. Transferring Clara's ownership interest in the home to Elena Moreno. It had then been filed with the county recorder's office, and Elena had waited. She waited 3 months. She waited until Clara was 8 months pregnant, moving with the careful, deliberate slowness of late pregnancy, spending her days working from home in the quiet of the house she had bought with her own money. She waited until the timing felt maximum, when Clara was most vulnerable, most distracted, most burdened with the physical weight of bringing a new life into the world. And then Elena came to the house on a Thursday morning. In February. She came with the eviction notice. She came with a copy of the filed quitclaim deed. She came with her lawyer, a man named Dennis Hart, who had represented Elena's property management company for years and who, crucially, did not know what Elena had actually done to obtain the deed. He believed he was simply there to formalize a legitimate property transfer. He was, as it would turn out, about to have the worst afternoon of his professional career through no fault of his own. And Elena came with a particular kind of performance-ready cruelty that only someone who has been planning a moment for months can produce. She was dressed beautifully. She was calm. She had her rings on. When Clara opened the front door, 8 months pregnant, in comfortable clothes, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, holding a mug of herbal tea, Elena looked at her with that smile that stopped at her cheekbones and said, "Good morning, Clara. I'm afraid we need to talk about the house." Clara took the documents. She looked at them. She looked at the quitclaim deed. She looked at her signature, her forged signature on the transfer line. She looked at Gerald Peck's notary seal. She looked at the filing stamp from the county recorder's office. She looked at the eviction notice that Elena had already had prepared. giving Clara 30 days to vacate the property that Elena now apparently owned. Then she looked at Dennis Hart, the lawyer, who was standing slightly behind Elena with the stiff posture of a man who is just now starting to realize that the situation he has been brought into might be more complicated than his client described. Then she looked at Elena Dot, and something in Clara's face went very quiet. Elena had expected tears. She had expected protests, confusion, panic. She had perhaps expected begging. She had spent months imagining this moment, and in every version of it she had imagined Clara had crumbled. Clara did not crumble. She said, in a voice so measured that it barely moved the air in the room, "Where is Marcus?" Elena smiled. "Marcus is aware of the situation. Is he here? He felt it was better if I handled this." Clara nodded slowly. She set down a tea. She took the documents, all of them, and held them in her hands with the careful, professional attention of a woman reading a contract. She was quiet for nearly a full minute. Elena stood in the doorway. Dennis Hart shifted his weight. "Dennis," Clara said, "Elena, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Elena's smile stayed in place. "This document is fraudulent," Clara said. "That is not my signature. I did not appear before any notary. I did not authorize any transfer of this property. What you have filed with the county recorder's office is a forged instrument, which is a felony in this state. What you have presented me with today is fraudulent eviction proceedings based on that forged instrument, which compounds the crime. And what you have done, Elena, is committed deed fraud, title fraud, forgery, document fraud, and depending on how this particular scheme was constructed, potentially wire fraud and mail fraud, which elevates this to federal territory." The silence in the doorway was extremely loud. "You have," Clara continued, still in that utterly controlled voice, "just forged legal documents to steal my house, the home I bought with my own money, where I am currently carrying your grandchild. And you did it using a notary whose seal I will have suspended within the week." Dennis Hart had gone a particular shade of pale that suggested several important realizations were occurring to him simultaneously. Elena's smile had not quite left her face, but it was doing something strange, struggling to stay in place, like a painting on a wall when the nail starts to pull out. "I understand," Elena said, with a composure that Clara genuinely admired in a purely professional sense. "That you're upset. I'm not upset," Clara said. "I'm documenting." She went inside, got her phone, and began photographing the documents. Every page, every signature, every filing stamp. She photographed the eviction notice. She photographed Elena standing in her doorway. She photographed Dennis Hart's business card when he, sweating slightly, offered it to her. Then she said, "Elena, I'm going to need you to leave my property now." Elena said, "This is my property now." Clara said, "No, it isn't. And if you continue to stand here, I will add trespass to the list. Please leave." Elena left. But what she didn't know, what neither she nor Marcus understood, was that the moment she walked back to her car and drove away, the clock had already started. Not a countdown to Clara's eviction, a countdown to Elena's destruction. Are moments in life when being an expert in precisely the thing that is being done to you becomes a kind of superpower that borders on terrifying. Clara was a property litigation attorney. She was not a generalist. She was not someone who had handled a deed case once or twice and therefore understood the basics. She was someone who had spent 15 years handling nothing but these cases, who knew every statute, every precedent, every procedural mechanism, every evidentiary standard, who knew the prosecutors and the county's financial crimes unit personally, who knew the clerk at the county recorder's office who could pull filing history in minutes, who knew exactly what evidence she needed, in exactly what form, to make a case so airtight that Elena Moreno wouldn't just lose, she would lose everything. Clara sat down at her desk, the beautiful wooden desk in the study of her home, the home she had chosen, the home she had furnished, the home with the nursery. She had spent 3 weekends painting a soft, warm yellow, and she began to work. She called her paralegal first. His name was James, and he had worked with her for 6 years. And when she explained what had happened, calmly, methodically, like describing a case rather than the worst day of her marriage, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Tell me what you need." She needed a title search. She needed the filing history on the deed from the county recorder's office. She needed the name and license number of the notary whose seal had been used. She needed to know when the document had been filed and who had filed it in person. She also needed her original deed, Her purchase documents, her bank records showing the transfer of funds for the down payment, her mortgage documents, and every piece of financial paper that established beyond any possible dispute that this was her house. She had all of it. Of course, she had all of it. She had been filing documents methodically since she was 12 years old. While James began pulling the title records, Clara made a second call. She called a friend, a woman named Priya, who was a prosecutor in the county's financial crimes division and who had known Clara since law school. They had stayed close over the years, meeting for dinner occasionally, sharing the particular dark humor of women who spent their professional lives watching what human beings were capable of doing to each other. Clara explained the situation. There was a pause. Then Priya said, "Someone forged a deed to steal a pregnant woman's house, and the pregnant woman is you." "Yes." Another pause. "Clara, you know I love you, but I need to say this. You are either the best or the worst possible victim for this crime. I know I'll put you in touch with someone in my unit today." Third call. This one was personal. Clara called her mother not to cry, though God knows she might have been entitled to, but because her mother was one of the steadiest people she had ever known, and she needed a steady voice. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, her mother said, "Do you want me to come?" "Not yet," Clara said. "Soon? You're all right." "I'm angry," Clara said, which is different. Her mother, who had known her daughter for 34 years, understood exactly what that meant. "All right," she said. "Call me tonight." Then Clara sat very still for a moment. Her hand rested on her stomach where her daughter they had found out at the 20-week scan that it was a girl was moving in that slow, rolling way of late pregnancy, unhurried and oblivious to the chaos above her. "It's okay," Clara said quietly, not to herself, to her daughter. "Mama's got it." Then she opened her laptop and began drafting the criminal complaint. The title search came back that same afternoon. It was worse than she had expected, and she had expected it to be bad. The quitclaim deed bearing her forged signature had been filed 11 days ago. The filing had been made in person by a representative of Eleanor's property management company, a fact established by the signature in the recorder's log. The notary seal belonged to one Gerald Peck, licensed notary public, operating out of an office on the east side of the city, with a clean record until now. But here is where it became particularly interesting. When James pulled the complete filing history on the deed, he found something that made him call Clara immediately, with a note of something in his voice that she recognized as the sound of a person who has just found the piece that breaks the entire puzzle open. The quitclaim deed had been filed days ago, but there was a second document, also filed with Gerald Peck's notary seal, also bearing what appeared to be Clara's signature, filed 3 weeks before the deed. It was an amendment to the property's title insurance policy, a document that, in technical terms, would have made it significantly harder for Clara to contest the transfer under the title insurance provisions she had taken out when she bought the house. In other words, before filing the fraudulent deed transfer, someone had filed a fraudulent document designed specifically to weaken Clara's ability to fight back. Whoever had planned this had known enough about property law to try to close off Clara's most obvious avenue of defense. Elena's property management company had been doing real estate transactions for 30 years. She knew the landscape. She had thought this through. What she had not thought through, what she could not have fully accounted for, because she had never had the misfortune of attempting to steal the house of someone who knew more about this process than she did, was that the second document, the preemptive defensive filing, actually made the conspiracy more provable, not less. It demonstrated planning, premeditation, an organized scheme with multiple steps. In criminal law, that distinction matters enormously. It is the difference between a crime of impulsive opportunity and a calculated, organized fraud operation. Clara stared at the two filed documents on her screen for a long time. Then she typed 3 words in her case. Notes: conspiracy, multiple counts. Marcos came home that evening at 7 o'clock. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, her documents, and a glass of water. She had changed into a clean sweater. She looked, to anyone who didn't know her, perfectly composed. Marcus walked in, set his keys down on the counter, and then looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop moving entirely. "You knew," Clara said. "It wasn't a question, Clara. You knew she was coming today." He did not answer immediately, and in that pause, that fraction of a second of calculation, Clara saw everything she needed to see. The man she had loved for 4 years. The man who called when he said he would call and who remembered the ring from the jewelry store window. was standing in her kitchen performing a version of innocence that was not quite real enough. I didn't know what she was going to do, he said carefully. She said she was going to talk to you about stealing my house. About the property arrangement, Marcus. Clara's voice was quiet but had the particular quality of a very sharp knife that looks like it's resting. Do not sit in front of me and pass words. Did you give her a sample of my signature? The pause again, and Clara, who had sat across from lying witnesses and depositions for 15 years, watched him decide in real time whether to try to hold the lie. She watched him calculate it. She watched him assess her face and realize slowly, with the dawning horror of a man who has made a catastrophic miscalculation, that she already knew the answer. I gave her an old check, he said. She said she needed it for what? Clara said. Finish that sentence. For what did she need a sample of my handwriting? He didn't finish it. Clara closed her laptop. I need you to understand something, she said. And I need you to hear me clearly, because I am only going to say this once. What your mother did today is a felony. Deed fraud. Forgery of a notarized instrument. Conspiracy to commit real property fraud. Those are not civil matters, Marcus. Those are criminal charges. I have already spoken to the county prosecutor's office. I have already filed a criminal complaint. I have already initiated the process to have the fraudulent deed voided, and I've already retained outside counsel to represent me in any civil proceedings, because I am obviously conflicted to represent myself. Marcus was very still. Now, Clara said, whether you are criminally implicated in this depends entirely on what you knew and when you knew it. That is not a question I am going to investigate tonight. That is a question for the investigators and prosecutors who will be contacting you. What I am going to tell you tonight is this. She stood up from the table. Get out of my house, Clara. Get out of my house. Marcus, you will hear from my attorney. There is a particular kind of loneliness in betrayal that arrives not in the moment of discovery, but in the hours after. When the adrenaline begins to settle and the house is quiet and you are alone with the truth of what has happened. Clara sat that night in the nursery, the room with the warm yellow walls she had painted herself, the crib she had assembled herself, the small bookshelf she had already started filling with the books she wanted to read to her daughter, and she allowed herself, finally, in the privacy of that small room, to feel it, not weakness. Clara didn't experience it as weakness. She experienced it as grief, because she had loved Marcus. She had loved him genuinely, in the careful, considered way of someone who doesn't give love easily but gives it completely when she does. She had believed in the life they were building. She had believed in the dinners, and the ring from the jewelry store, and the Sunday mornings, and all of it, and now she was sitting in a nursery, 8 months pregnant, and the man she loved had handed her forged signature to his mother because he could not say no to the woman who had raised him, not even when what she was asking him to enable was the theft of his wife's home. Clara let herself feel that for exactly as long as she needed to. She cried quietly, not dramatically, and she let herself be sad, and then she dried her face and she went back to work. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised even Clara. Priya's contact in the financial crimes unit was a detective named Raymond Cole, a compact, serious man in his 40s with the exhausted eyes of someone who has seen too many versions of human greed but who still, clearly, cared about the job. He came to Clara's house 2 days after she filed the complaint. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened to her explain the situation with the quiet attention of a man who understood that she was both a witness and an expert. He asked good questions. She gave precise answers. She showed him everything, the 2 fraudulent filings, the title search results, the documentation of her original purchase, the bank records. She explained the significance of the preemptive amendment to the title insurance, the evidence of planning it represented. Detective Cole took everything. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Ms. Whitfield Moreno, I have to say, I've worked deed fraud cases for 8 years. Most victims come in here not understanding half of what happened to them. You have given me a more complete and accurate case summary than most prosecutors give me. I prosecuted a case almost identical to this in 2019, Clara said. I know what you need. He nodded. I'm going to pull Gerald Peck in tomorrow. Gerald Peck, it turned out, was not a man built for adversity. He was 51 years old, had a mortgage of his own, had a wife, had 2 kids in college. And when Detective Cole sat across from him in an interview room and explained, with the quiet precision that good investigators use, exactly what charges he was facing and exactly what the evidence already showed, Gerald Peck became the most cooperative witness in the history of the County Financial Crimes Unit. He gave them everything. He confirmed that Elena had approached him 6 weeks prior. He confirmed that she had provided what she described as authorization for the document, a claim he admitted he had not verified with any rigor. Because Elena was a longtime client and he trusted her and, frankly, the money had been good. He described the specific steps he had taken to prepare and notarize the fraudulent quitclaim deed. He confirmed the second document, the title insurance amendment, had also come through his office, also with a signature he had not verified. He confirmed that he had filed both documents. He gave them the dates, the times, the exact amounts Elena had paid him, the account that payments had come from. Gerald Peck was, by the end of 3 hours, no longer a co-conspirator in any meaningful sense. He was a witness that Elena, Clara knew, would try to fight. Elena was not Gerald Peck. She had resources. She had a property management company. She had Dennis Hart, though Dennis Hart, upon learning the full facts of what his client had actually done, had withdrawn from her representation with the particular speed of a lawyer who has just discovered that his client is not the reasonable person he believed her to be. Elena had her money. She had the Marino family connections. She would not fold easily. And there was still Marcus. The question of Marcus, what he had known, what he had enabled, what responsibility he bore, was one that Clara had been wrestling with, not as his wife, but as a lawyer. The legal question was one thing. He had provided a signature sample, which could be construed as unwitting cooperation in the fraud if he genuinely hadn't known what his mother intended. Or it could be construed as knowing participation if he had. The personal question was another. She had loved him. She had been building a life with him. She was carrying his child. And he had handed a sample of her handwriting to his mother, and then stayed out of the way while his mother came to evict her from her own home. The love and the facts sat side by side in Clara's heart, and she looked at them both honestly, and she made her decision. Elena was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after she had stood in Clara's doorway with her eviction notice and her triumphant smile. 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit went to her home, her large, immaculately maintained home in the nice part of the city, and they arrested her on charges of deed fraud, forgery of a notarized instrument, conspiracy to commit real property fraud, and filing a false instrument with a public office. The charges were serious. They were felonies, and because the scheme had involved communication across state lines, Elena had apparently consulted with a contact in another state about the document preparation strategy, the federal wire fraud angle that Clara had identified on day 1 was being actively reviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Elena was handcuffed in her own driveway. One of her neighbors saw it happen. By that evening, the information had reached the community of property managers and real estate professionals who knew Elena's company, and the phone was ringing with calls that Elena was not in a position to answer because she was busy with her booking paperwork. Dennis Hart, Clara's own attorney, had filed the civil suit simultaneously, a motion to void the fraudulent deed, filing and restore clear title to Clara's property, along with a suit for damages that included compensation for the emotional distress caused to a woman who was 8 months pregnant when the scheme was executed against her. The civil case, unlike the criminal one, would not require the elevated standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. It would require a preponderance of evidence more likely than not, and given that Clara had Gerald Peck's full testimony, the original purchase records, and Elena's clearly documented history of targeting the property, the preponderance of evidence was approximately the height of a skyscraper. But there was one more thing, one more piece that Clara had been quietly, methodically assembling since the day Elena stood in her doorway. She had been looking at Elena's property management company. Because here is the thing about a woman who has been in the business of real estate fraud long enough to execute a scheme this sophisticated, with this level of premeditation, with a specific forger on retainer, that is generally not the first time. And Clara, who had spent 15 years in property litigation, knew exactly how to find the other times it took her team, James, her paralegal, her outside counsel, and eventually a forensic document examiner she brought in as a consultant, about 2 weeks to find the pattern. Over the course of the past 6 years, Elena's property management company had been involved in 7 other property transfers that now, under examination, looked deeply suspicious. 3 involved elderly clients of the company whose properties had been transferred with apparent efficiency into arrangements that benefited Elena's company. 2 involved low-income property owners who had subsequently lost their property. 2 foreclosure under circumstances that, in retrospect, appear to have been engineered. One involved a transfer of commercial property that the original owner, a man now in a nursing home with dementia, had apparently signed over, though his family maintained he would never have done so willingly. 7 cases. Over 6 years. A pattern. Gerald Peck, when confronted with the specifics of these cases, was able to confirm his involvement in 3 of them. The scope of what Elena had been doing, not just to Clara, but to a parade of other property owners who had the profound misfortune of crossing her path, was not a single crime. It was a criminal enterprise. And when the federal investigators, who had been reviewing the wire fraud angle on Clara's case, received this additional information, the nature of their interest expanded considerably. This was no longer just a mother-in-law stealing her daughter-in-law's house. This was organized real estate fraud over a period of years. This was Rika Teratari. Clara's daughter was born on a Sunday morning in late March, 6 weeks after Elena had been arrested. Her name was Nora Dot. She was 7 pounds and 3 ounces, and she arrived in the world with the particular indifference to drama that newborns have, interested only in warmth and presence and sustenance. Entirely unbothered by the legal proceedings surrounding her birth, Clara's mother had come to stay 2 weeks before the due date and was in the room when Nora arrived. A solid, steady presence exactly where Clara needed her. Marcus was not there. Clara had spoken to him once, briefly, in the weeks since Elena's arrest. He had called, not to defend himself, but to say, in a voice that sounded genuinely broken, that he was sorry. That he hadn't known what his mother was going to do. That he had given her the signature sample because she had told him she needed it for insurance paperwork, and he had believed her because he always believed her, because he had never been able to see who she actually was. Clara had listened. She had believed him, not entirely, not with the automatic trust she once had, but enough to believe that Marcus was not a malicious actor but a weak one, which is its own kind of damage but a different kind. I believe you, she had said. I believe you didn't know, and I need you to understand that it doesn't change anything. She filed for divorce in the 2nd week of March. It was not an angry divorce, which was almost harder than an angry one would have been. It was a sad divorce, the careful, documented ending of something that had genuinely been good for a while, before the weight of who Marcus was, and more importantly who his mother was, had come to bear on it. Clara's outside counsel handled the proceedings. She did not represent herself. She was scrupulous about that. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The house remained hers. Not that this was ever truly in doubt. The deed fraud voiding had been completed in the civil court within 6 weeks of the filing, and clear title had been restored to Clara's name, sole name, not joint, within months. The civil suit against Elena was proceeding in parallel with the criminal case, and the damages sought were substantial. Elena Marino's trial began 11 months after her arrest. By the time it started, the charges had expanded considerably. The federal wire fraud counts had been added. The investigation into the other 7 property victims had resulted in additional criminal complaints that were being prosecuted in a coordinated action with the state charges. 3 of those additional victims had joined Clara's civil suit. Elena had retained a new lawyer, an expensive one, the kind who shows up at difficult trials with an immaculate suit and a strategy built on casting doubt, creating confusion, pointing at Gerald Peck as the architect of everything and positioning Elena as a woman who had been deceived by a fraudulent notary. It was not an unreasonable strategy. It would have been very effective against a different kind of victim. It was not effective against Clara. Clara testified for nearly 4 hours. She was calm, precise, and devastating. She walked the jury through the complete documentation of her original purchase, through the title history, through the specific technical significance of each fraudulent filing, through the preemptive title insurance amendment and what its existence demonstrated about the level of planning involved. She explained, in terms that were clear enough for a non-lawyer and detailed enough to withstand cross-examination, exactly how the scheme had worked and exactly why it could not have been executed without Elena's direct orchestration. Elena's attorney cross-examined her for an hour and 40 minutes. He did not land a single meaningful blow. At one point, trying to suggest that Clara had perhaps misidentified the significance of the preemptive filing, the attorney asked her to clarify whether a title insurance amendment of this type might not have legitimate routine uses. Clara looked at him patiently and said, "In 31 years of combined case history that I reviewed in preparation for this testimony, I found 4 instances of this type of amendment being filed in circumstances similar to this one. In all 4 cases, It was filed as part of a deed fraud scheme. If you have contrary precedent, I would be interested to see it. He moved on. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Elena was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. The federal charges added a concurrent sentence. Her property management company was liquidated to partially compensate the victims, including the 7 other property owners whose cases had been consolidated. Gerald Peck received a suspended sentence and probation in exchange for his testimony and his surrender of his notary license. On the day the sentence was handed down, Clara was in the courtroom. She had Nora with her, 5 months old by then, sitting in a carrier against Clara's chest, looking around the room with the wide, examining eyes of a baby who finds everything new and interesting. Clara listened to the sentence. She did not. She did not cry. She simply sat there, her hand resting gently on her daughter's back, breathing evenly. When Elena was led out of the courtroom, she looked at Clara once, just once. Clara met her eyes. She held them. She didn't look away, didn't perform forgiveness, didn't offer anything at all except the steady, unflappable gaze of a woman who had done exactly what needed to be done and knew it. Elena looked away. First, the civil judgment came 2 months later. The court awarded Clara compensatory damages for the emotional distress inflicted during the fraudulent eviction attempt. The attempt carried out against a woman in the final weeks of her pregnancy, a detail that the court noted specifically in the damages analysis. It awarded punitive damages in recognition of the deliberate, calculated nature of the scheme. It awarded attorney's fees. It awarded costs. The total judgment was in 7 figures. Clara's attorney called her when the judgment came through. She was at her kitchen table, the same kitchen where she had sat across from Marcus on the night she told him to leave. The same kitchen where she had made 3 phone calls on the day Elena arrived at her door, and she was nursing Nora, who was oblivious to the phone call and focused entirely on more pressing priorities. "Congratulations," her attorney said. "Thank you," Clara said. "How long to collect?" "Elena's assets are largely frozen, pending the criminal restitution. It'll take time, but you'll get it." "I know," Clara said. And she did know. She was a property attorney. She knew how to wait for what was owed. A year after Elena's arrest, on a quiet Saturday morning in April, Clara was in the nursery when Nora pulled herself up to standing for the first time, gripping the railing of the crib, small legs trembling with effort, face locked in the expression of pure, focused determination that Clara had begun to recognize as her daughter's signature look. Nora stood. She swayed. She looked at Clara with enormous dark eyes, astonished at herself. Clara sat on the floor of the warm yellow nursery and clapped her hands and said, "There you go, there you go, that's it." And Nora, delighted by the response, let go of the crib rail. She didn't fall. She stood on her own. For 3 whole seconds, swaying slightly with the effort of it, before sitting down with a soft thump and immediately looking interested in the carpet. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that doesn't have any grief in it, the kind that is purely, simply joy. This is the thing about people who believe they can take things from others, simply because they have the audacity to try. They count on the target not knowing how to fight back. They count on fear, on ignorance, on the paralysis that comes from being overwhelmed by the legal complexity of what's being done to you. They count on the power imbalance, the experienced schemer versus the ordinary person who has never had to navigate a deed fraud case. What they cannot account for, what Elena Moriano could not account for, sitting across from a woman who was 8 months pregnant and looked, on the surface, like someone manageable, is that sometimes the person in front of you knows more than you do, knows more about the law, knows more about the evidence, knows more about exactly how badly what you've done is going to end for you. Elena came to that door with a forged document and a plan. She had spent months constructing. She had forgotten, or never known, that the woman she was doing it to had spent 15 years building the exact expertise needed to take the plan apart. Every piece of it. And she had done it while 8 months pregnant, without losing her composure once. There is a kind of strength that announces itself loudly, that shouts and performs and fills a room with the noise of its own certainty. And then there is Clara's kind of strength. The kind that sits very still. The kind that listens. The kind that says no, just once, cleanly, without elaboration, and means it with every fiber of its being. The kind that, when pushed past what any reasonable person should have to endure, does not collapse or rage or beg. It documents, it calls the prosecutor, it builds the case, it wins. Clara kept the house, she finished the nursery, she read to Nora. From the books on that small shelf every night, stories about brave girls. About women who were smart and strong and kind. About the kind of mother Clara was determined to be and was. Every single day. She went back to work 6 months after Nora was born, part-time at first, then full. Her firm had held her position. Her colleagues who had followed the news of Elena's arrest with a particular fascination of a legal community, watching one of their own get targeted and fight back, welcomed her return with a kind of respect that is earned rather than offered. She took on more deed fraud cases, it seemed. She told James one morning over coffee, like the obvious specialization. He had laughed. "You're going to be terrifying," he said. "I was already terrifying," she said. "Now I'm personal about it." She kept the house, and she raised her daughter in it. And on some evenings she sat on the back porch while Nora toddled around the small garden, and she thought about Elena, about Marcus, about the night she had sat in the nursery and cried and then dried her face and gone back to work. She thought about all of it without bitterness, which was the thing she was proudest of, not the legal victory, not the judgment, not the 7-figure damages award, but the fact that she had carried all of it without letting it make her smaller, had been betrayed. She had been targeted in a scheme of breathtaking cruelty, executed at the most vulnerable moment of her life. She had lost the marriage she had believed in. She had sat alone, 8 months pregnant, and faced a woman who had tried to take her home, and she had won. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with a single climactic confrontation or a film-worthy moment of revelation. She had won the way she did everything methodically, thoroughly, without a single document out of place. She had won because she knew the law. She had won because she was prepared. She had won because when Elena Moreno handed her that eviction notice with her forged signature on it and smiled at her with that smile that stopped at the cheekbones, Clara had looked at it and thought, "Not, I'm ruined, but this is a felony." And she had been absolutely right. People sometimes ask, in stories like this, whether the protagonist felt sorry for the antagonist, whether the victory came with grace and forgiveness, whether there was a redemptive moment, a reconciliation, a softening of the edges for Marcus. With time, there was something like forgiveness, or at least understanding. He had been weak, not malicious. He had loved his mother in a way that left no room for his wife, and he had done damage because of it, but the damage had not been deliberate. He was paying child support faithfully. He saw Nora on weekends. It was, Clara thought, genuinely trying not to win her back, which she seemed to understand was not possible, but to be the father that Nora deserved. She could work with that. For Nora's sake, she could work with that. For Elena, the woman who had planned and executed and nearly succeeded in stealing her home, who had targeted a pregnant woman with calculation and coldness and a smile that stopped at the cheekbones, Clara did not feel sorrow. She didn't feel triumph either, not in the way that triumph is supposed to feel in stories. She felt something simpler. She felt correct. She had done the right thing. She had used every tool available to her to ensure that what was wrong was made right, and what was criminal was prosecuted, and what was stolen was returned. She had done it while pregnant. She had done it while heartbroken. She had done it while maintaining, through all of it, the particular kind of ethical integrity that her profession demanded. She had never once abused her knowledge, never cut corners, never retaliated in ways that stepped outside the law. She had simply relentlessly, thoroughly, completely used the system as it was designed to be used, to protect people like her against people like Elena. It had worked. It doesn't always work. Clara knew that. She had seen cases where it didn't work, where the fraud was too well constructed, or the victim too isolated, or the evidence too thin. She had taken those cases home with her and lost sleep over them. She knew the system was imperfect and that justice, even when available, was not evenly distributed. But she also knew this. For every Elena Moreno who believes that the person she is targeting is too vulnerable to fight back, too overwhelmed to understand what's being done to them, too pregnant to do anything but crumble, there is a chance that the person she has targeted knows exactly what she's doing, knows the statute numbers, knows the evidence standards, knows Gerald Peck's notary seal is invalid under Section 4 of the State Notary Code. Elena Moreno had knocked on the wrong door, and in the years that followed, when Clara stood in front of juries, or sat across from clients who had been victimized by deed fraud, or trained young attorneys in the intricacies of real property litigation, she sometimes told this story. Not as a story about herself, or about what had been done to her, but as a story about preparation, about knowledge, about the fact that the law is a tool, and like all tools, it rewards the person who knows how to use it. She would tell the story, and she would watch the young attorneys in the room lean forward, eyes bright, taking notes, as she would think of Nora, at home with her grandmother, standing on her own 2 feet in the warm yellow nursery, looking around the room with her mother's eyes. There you go. There you go, that's it. Stand on your own. Some people come into your life as lessons. Some come as chapters that close. And sometimes, the people who try hardest to break you end up being the reason. You discover exactly how unbreakable you are. Clara didn't just keep her house. She kept herself. And that, in the end, was the only thing that had ever truly been in question.